Welcome to the Cyber Kumite. I'm Tim Wainwright, and this is Chris Salerno. Our guest today is Owen Zacharias, and we're talking cloud security. Today's Kumite is brought to you by Miasma One, the cloud transformation company that doesn't know the meaning of "we're not quite ready for this much change." Miasma One consulting teams are made up of certified cloud architects, security specialists, PhD psychologists, and goons who just know how to get things done. Miasma One, we can do this the easy way or the hard way.
Owen, thanks for joining us first. It's a pleasure to talk to you again. We've seen a lot of companies transition to cloud solutions during the pandemic here in order to support the remote workforce, because basically everybody's still working from home in one fashion or another. Anytime this rapid transformation happens, we tend to see security overlooked. Do you think that's the case here with these transitions to cloud? And if yes, what's the most common pitfall you think we see here?
Well, Chris, Tim, thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah.
And so I have seen, a lot of security issues, as far as cloud adoption. And the source of this can be varied, because of the easy accessibility of the cloud, especially for R&D organizations within enterprises. The low barrier to entry, the fact that you don't need to incur kind of capital expenditure to get started means that R&D or even individual developers are oftentimes off and running before the broader IT organization. Security organizations have a chance to even catch up with them. And so what that leads to is a really rapid build out within the cloud and everyone else playing catch up. And this is, I've seen this time and again, where oftentimes functional requirements will take precedence over the non-functional requirements. And it's very easy to get started quickly in the cloud. But it's also not a consequence-free environment, especially as it pertains to security and cost. So you can very quickly see cost overruns, security best practices just out the window, and you're oftentimes playing cleanup if you have a good basis for the build, and oftentimes you don't. It might be novel technologies that you first have to research to even understand.
So are there no real good, like if you're standing this stuff up, let's just take AWS, for instance, by default, are things insecure, secure, or you're asked to make choices and it may be difficult to decide which choices to make?
Everything's possible to be made secure. And I think that the cloud providers do a good job of offering you those tools, but they really do also allow you to shoot yourself in the foot and to just kind of go out the door with even a product that has not been thoroughly evaluated. Mm. So the tools are there. It's whether or not you choose to use them. Gotcha. And out of the box, a lot of times, an AWS account doesn't have those strong, the strong governance around it.
So Owen, you just said governance, and I literally was gonna, as you were talking, was thinking like, this sounds like more than anything a governance issue. And I say that with just a little bit of a chip on my shoulder, because I do believe in governance, but security people like to talk about risk and governance so much that it often just turns into going into meetings, making paper, and then not doing anything. How have you seen good governance go in over cloud that isn't just that actually gets actioned and enforced?
A number of tools allow for, I would say, kind of between the proactive and reactive side of governance, because everything is an API for the most part, because everything can start out as code. You can start with analyzing what you're going to build, before it's been built. And this can be done by security teams, by development teams. Everyone has the ability because they all have this information right in front of them. And in the case of AWS, there are a number of great reactive tools. And so you take config for example, or guard duty that are set up. There's almost no barrier to entry to set those up, and they can start offering both a governance side and then a automatic remediation. I would say maybe more on the compliance side, and it does take some work to set those up and get them operating, but in the case of Amazon, they're constantly improving on these tools, but you need to track that. You need to figure out where your gaps are and what they're implementing.
Yeah. So who leads that then? Because it sounds like, if you just go in and read the documentation on these controls as they evolve and stay on top of them. So you put your architects on them, whether they consider themselves cloud security architects or not. That's a whole nother thing. But you put good people on this with a lot of curiosity who want to learn it. How do you do that? Do you have them start and say, go and figure out what can be done in these cloud environments, draft a bunch of controls, and then we'll put them through a governance process to make sure everybody agrees to it? I mean, what would work there? Because I have a feeling that if you just start with the meetings and saying we're going to do a cloud center of excellence or cloud governance and just sit down and dive right into the meetings without actually knowing what you can do, are you going to get anywhere?
And it does take a basis, in the system that you're operating, right? So we need to have people who at least have some semblance of knowledge of what the suite of security related compliance tools, are available. But what's nice is that there's no barrier, much like there's no barrier to entry for, a given R&D organization to get started. There's nothing stopping a security related focus of diving right in. Right? Whether it's one account or 100 accounts, you have everything in front of you. You can start writing simple scripts to interrogate entire organizations and to quickly land on, what do you need to be monitoring, where are your gaps? And so you're oftentimes linking existing services together through, modest scripts. But it's great because it is there in front of you. There's really no mystery beyond that.
That's great. So you mentioned how you're seeing the native tools in these platforms continue to evolve. At this point, do you think, and I love how you said, paraphrased, anything can be secured. And I love that because we should always believe that in our space. It doesn't mean it's easy to secure, but anything can be secured. How much more difficult is it to secure a cloud environment to get, so to speak, the parity that we've talked about for a couple of years, parity with on-prem enterprise type infrastructure? What's your view of that? Is it harder to do in cloud, or is it just easier to make mistakes? And I say that knowing that we've, organizations have made lots and lots of mistakes with their on-prem security for a long, long time. Is it the same thing, just with different tools? Is it easier? Is it harder? Where do you see it?
It's complicated. It's certainly different, but one of the, we'll take AWS for example. One of the underlying areas is that you can use the same languages, the same, especially as it pertains to policy evaluation. It's a single language for the entire ecosystem. So it is more difficult because you have to ramp up and learn that. But once you're up and running, you have a team that can support, myriad services across the board, whether they're the more traditional kind of server networking services, whether they're the repackaged open source software, or whether they're totally novel, right? The serverless compute or NoSQL databases. It's all the same policy languages. So once you have a workforce that's really adept at analyzing those, understanding the pitfalls there, it's very, very powerful. But there is a ramp, right? There's certainly a lot to get used to.
So let me break it down to two areas too. When I talk about the difficulty of securing cloud and how you approach it, how about preventative versus detective controls? Is there a difference? Do you have the sense that it's easier to implement hardening and preventative controls and maybe more difficult to get good at detection, or is that not necessarily the case?
Some of it depends on how your users are developing in the cloud. And as we see more and more movement towards kind of modern development processes, continuous integration, continuous deployment, and that general DevOps umbrella, everything is delivered as code, which means at that point you can be quite proactive, but you need to be engaged right at that code development level. using all the same development tools that developers are. Some organizations are not there yet, and they're still doing a lot of manual work. I would say at that point, the native reactive AWS tooling is great. Again, mentioned Amazon Config. There are a number of other tools, Guard Duty, Macy, which will sit and watch and learn. It's very straightforward to set up. Understanding the results out of these is a little bit more difficult, and obviously reducing the false positives. But once that's humming, those are fantastic tools as well.
So sorry, one quick question in there, Tim. When we're looking at those tools that you named, and there's native ones for AWS and Azure and others, is that where the space is right now? We're relying on the providers to provide those tools to us, or are there third-party tools that are effective?
There definitely third-party tools exist, but especially in the case of Amazon, they're putting a lot of effort into their in-house tooling, and you see releases almost weekly.
Yeah,
and they're treating, I would say, these security updates or security features, right, as full-fledged features, where others might just kind of consider them table stakes or not something they would advertise. And so they're clearly putting a lot of effort in, because I think that they realize the benefit. If I were going to choose whether to take a security tool that I knew was tried and trusted, worked on-prem, no matter how much I was attached to it, I would be careful evaluating it against the cloud. I'd have to have some very, very strong reasons for it, because there's almost certainly an Amazon, again, speaking to Amazon a lot, almost certainly a competitor that they have in place or are working on. And so, with that being attached to any of the cloud services, looking at your engagement, with the vendor to understand their roadmap, and understand where they're going to be in 12 months, because you implementing something that they're just going to do for you is frustrating.
Yeah, we already know a lot of engineering teams spend a lot of time and don't even really get to fully implement tools in traditional on-prem. They never kind of get them quite there. And so, Chris, kind of a question for you, because I think that you've got some perspective on you've got a lot of perspective on SecOps, and I think Owen's coming more from architecture engineering background. And I think about when I think about how transversal cloud skills are to a security team, everybody needs them regardless of their function. So we talked about governance, and I even poked a little fun at governance, but they need to understand this stuff. Security testing needs to know how to test applications that are in the cloud and cloud infrastructures. Architecture and engineering needs to know how to design and build these things. And then SecOps needs to know how to monitor for it. Is that a relative, is that a gradient of cloud security awareness and skills right now, kind of state of the industry? Maybe aside from governance, because I think that varies a lot, but I would guess that security testers, pen testers, red teams are probably, for what they need to know about cloud, probably have a lot of that skill now. The good ones who are staying up on it. Architecture and engineering also have a head start, because they've been asked to get involved in these transformation projects and to start designing and helping to kind of guide these implementations. And it's similar to the question I asked Owen before, but I realize you might have some perspective on this too. Is security operations ready to monitor cloud security events and respond to them the same way that they've been training and practicing for years now in the enterprise environment? Or do you find that with the SecOps teams that you run and the ones that you talk to, that they're pretty much where the other security disciplines are?
Yeah, that's interesting, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts too, Owen. From a SecOps perspective, what we've seen is there's two layers to this. There's actual cloud security events, and then there's the events that happen on the thing that you're hosting in the cloud. The events that happen in the thing that you're hosting in the cloud, like a Windows server or a Linux server or whatever it may be, that's all the same, right? We're just getting the event codes from a different spot, and it just happens to be hosted in Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Oracle Cloud, wherever it may be. So that part hasn't changed. SecOps is good there. The different part is, I think, some of the tools that Owen was talking about with, CloudWatch, CloudTrail, et cetera. when we look at those and say, hey, these are new events, these are different logs that we haven't seen before. That's really where I think, Owen, your point before came in. You actually need to understand the cloud environment in which you're operating in to be able to read the logs that are coming out of it. If you don't understand the operations of the cloud environment, reading the logs is going to be very difficult. And a lot of the conversations we have with clients that we talk to in this space that have in-house security operations teams, or ones where we're working in concert with their security operation teams, that seems to be a skill gap when we look at the skills across their operations team. They say, yeah, we don't really have a lot of experts in AWS, Azure, et cetera. And it points to, I think what you were saying as well, Owen, that low barrier to entry. Everybody's just trying whatever cloud platform they feel like, regardless of what security learned about that environment. Now we have to learn 4 environments instead of just one. If we would have just picked AWS, the SecOps team just has to get very familiar with a few tools there. Now we've got 4 different environments plus our traditional enterprise environment. So I think there's still a big skill gap there.
Yes. Speaking of 4 environments, that was really generous of you to mention Oracle.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, they thank you.
Yeah.
Not a sponsor.
No, it did come up in conversation the other week, and I asked why. Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of what we've seen there. The Owen, have you seen difficulty in monitoring these environments? Is it harder to get a grasp on what these logs look like? And I've seen logs that look very different from a traditional Windows log or syslog coming from any system that we've seen in the past. The events are just simply different. So I think there's just a learning curve. Maybe that's been your experience too.
It absolutely agree with that. And I think that it is fairly straightforward to set up logging in these environments. But what you're doing with those logs and understanding them, it is the hard part. You mentioned, Amazon's CloudTrail earlier, which is a complete log of every single API, right? So it's every action. It's a huge amount of data. Yet we've gone in to do some forensics on accounts and seen CloudTrail was turned off. Okay, so that should have been the first thing that was done, right? When we're setting up this account and it's now data lost. So making sure that you have everything enabled, is the first part. But what you do with that, there's a ton of power, and there's a ton of great open source tooling that exists out there that people have, they're giving away their kind of log analysis tools, and they're multi-sourcing. They're looking at a number of different event sources, in the account itself. But one thing that Amazon does well, but also kind of does poorly, is their approach to kind of multi-account and multi-region. Traditionally, the model was a single account, maybe a handful of accounts for a development, test, production setup. Now they're seeing organizations with hundreds of accounts, and the tooling around that orchestration, around the consolidation or aggregation of logs and the analysis of those, it is on a service by service basis, and for the most part, kind of immature. The idea that you can have workloads running in different regions around the planet. The fact that Amazon built these to be completely separate, meaning that if you lose, if they were to lose Amazon S3 in Virginia, that Oregon would be okay.
Yeah.
But I think that that's driven some of their architectural decisions, because they don't have many services that will be cross-region. But if you're operating in more than one region, you certainly need to be aware of those. So I think there's still a gap there. I believe that they're fixing that, but because I think other cloud providers don't have that breadth, that they haven't had to solve that yet.
That's interesting. Owen, I had one more question. Maybe Tim has another. But when cloud really started becoming popular, the most common vulnerability that we saw was just someone left a bucket open and like, hey, let's go grab all the information out of that bucket. We're kind of still there. We still see that, right? But people have figured out, all right, we should lock down the bucket. what's the next bucket thing? Is it like IAM controls? Like what are we all worried about right now?
And bucket security is still a problem, right? It's kind of funny that it is. And right, so the cloud provider says, we're going to offer you the security of the cloud, and it's your responsibility to build security, on top of us in the cloud. They give examples, they give advice, they even build new tooling, right? But at some point, you're responsible. And so I know that's a broad answer, but all of these novel services that go beyond just server and network, they all have ways to bypass these complex policy languages that oftentimes are a Venn diagram of three different policies. You have the cryptographic key management service, or KMS, in Amazon has three different ways to secure a key, and you need to be able to look at all three, see to understand the result of what's actually happening. And it's difficult until you have a skilled workforce who understands these. Amazon, in this case, and I have to imagine the other providers, don't do this for you. So that we're going to see issues across the board there, right? As more and more workloads leave the server, it changes. I think it just changes the attack vector.
Gotcha.
It's actually kind of a little scary to me, because the idea of open buckets is a pretty simple misconfiguration. And if I'm summarizing, it sounds like you're saying there's going to be more complex misconfigurations that could result in those types of issues in the future, since there are so many design choices we can make, and they won't be quite down to the basic bucket element and so yikes. So yeah, we really need to upskill. And I think that takes us to, probably a good place to land on this, Kumite. And we talked a little bit about, what is the state of skills and security skills in different teams around this. What's your advice for practitioners, whether they're have IT backgrounds or have security backgrounds or otherwise, who really want to dive into this, who can have a passion for it, who will read the many manuals, dive into the certs. What's your advice for them in terms of how they can get started, but not just how they can get started, how can they get good at this? And before you answer that question, a final word from our sponsor. Larry was a veteran data center manager and one of the best in the business. He had a hard time with the company's direction to move to the cloud, but Miasma One coached Larry to comfort with the changes and helped get the job done. No one has seen Larry in a few weeks, and he was notably absent from his retirement party. That's Miasma One. There's nothing we won't do to move you to the cloud. Again, Owen, that question was for professionals who want to get deep and get good at cloud. What's your advice to them?
Well, I don't think there's any substitute for just operational experience. And because anyone can set up a cloud account, there's no reason why you can't be playing with any service that your enterprise is using. You can play with it on an hourly basis and then destroy it. And so there's great opportunity there. There should be no barrier to entry.
Yeah, you scared me for a second because you said operational experience, and that's also part of the problem. Because I haven't done it yet. Like, how do I do it? But you're saying operational experience means you can do it. You can get into this and start playing with this stuff, and you don't have to do it in a profession, in a production live environment to really understand and get your cloud legs.
Exactly. There shouldn't be a barrier to entry at that point. And the certification process, the exams really do speak to that. There's a certain level of studying and preparation you can do, but if you haven't been in the weeds with this stuff, it's going to be very difficult to kind of achieve that level of certification. In addition, I would say that some level of application development or scripting, because you'll move so much faster, right? Having that ability to quickly parse through a large set of accounts, right? When everything is an API, the information is really at your fingertips. And so a lot of people get started through the web interface into these cloud providers, but very quickly, I recommend getting into the code. And it's not difficult by any means once you start poking around.
That's great. Great advice. Thanks, Owen. Thanks for joining us today and getting into this topic, hitting it from a bunch of angles in a short amount of time. Our guest again has been Owen Zacharias. I'm Tim Wainwright, reminding you that I taught Chris everything he knows.
And I'm Chris Salerno, and that means my cloud was literally Tim's computer.